Yield still king. How can we cut back on utilizing our typical fertilizer approach in the future? We're going to have to do. I don't believe for 1 second that in 2023 that cost of that fertilizer is going to be any cheaper than it is today. I don't believe that for a second. So we got to take this is what we're in a new future. We've got to take new steps to do this. So there's four things that I have tested over the years that I think have some validity in either enhancing the role of fertilizer. In other words, let me utilize starter and get that 40, 30, 40 bushel increase that I need, or that can be used to replace some of the starter in that mix. In other words, use less fertilizer and some of this material to drive that uptake, root system development, phosphorus uptake, and yield. So those four things, and some of these you guys are well familiar with: humic or fulvic acids. They work best, in my opinion, and we tested. You could see, I just showed some data on some. They work best when you add them to a fertilizer, and they're about worth a 4, maybe an 8 bushel bump in the right conditions. They're not consistent, but they do have some utility in certain situations. Biologicals, these are probably the new kid on the block, is these bacterial endomycorrhiza or vascular mycorrhizal materials that are touted as being biologicals. Part of the problem with the biologicals today is that you can do about anything and say it's a biological. We're doing a lot of in-lab testing here these days, and a lot of materials just don't have any live biology or even sufficient numbers of dead bacteria that would make it work. So we're a little concerned about how these products are coming, but I think there are some good biologicals. You saw a couple products there that we tested. I think there is going to be some path forward here, but as of this date, they're sort of inconsistent as well. Growth regulators, the products I showed, that Radiate product from Nutrien is a growth regulator for roots. Again, it's a product that's just coming on into its own. I think it's probably more consistent than some of these others that I've just mentioned. But again, it's going to require us to look at these. And again, it's a chemical treatment. And then we have charged molecules. And that's where I really want to focus our attention here today, because unlike some of these others, the biologicals, the growth regulators, we have a history with understanding charged particles, particularly at molecules. And what you remember, I'm classifying charged molecules as things like Avail, Nutrisphere, and the new products that we see on the market today, NutriCharge, which is some of the work that we've been doing with NutriCharge gives me a really strong indication that these charged molecules have come into their own. With this next generation of materials here is really showing consistent and strong results. And I think these have a real role to play in our future in reducing or utilizing fertilizer in a very different way. Yeah, just to step back as we talk about these charged molecules a little bit. This is some data that we had of the old Avail materials out there. And you can see again, no starter versus a 12-12-4. And then the dark blue bar is the 12-12-4 with the Avail. And you can see we were enhancing that starter effect and leading to a better yield response. So our average yield increase from starter was 6 bushels. With the additive, we jumped that to 12 bushels in this case. So here was a good illustration of what I just talked. 6 bushel, I can't afford the fertilizer for 6 bushels. But at 12, now I'm getting the kind of response that I need, and again, growing better roots. I'm not going to show the data, but we had lots of data that showed that we increased root mass, the depth of root ball, and many other including the stalk diameter, which is an indication of better root development in early corn. So we have lots of data on these early generation products such as Avail that showed they did have some utility in improving the response to starter fertilizer. Let's just, I showed this, I think, a year ago. This is probably the most striking evidence of what we're seeing from these next generation charge molecules like NutriCharge. So here's no starter. So here's a no starter plot here, just as I showed in an earlier picture here. Again, corn looks fairly healthy. I wouldn't turn this corn down. Here's 20 gallons of that 1027 in the 2x2 band. And you clearly see, as I step back and forth here, the difference. Yeah, it's gotten bigger. You can even see the nitrogen impact. This is yellow, has yellowing here. Here's darker green. We're picking up nitrogen. This is the effect that is in, this is that root effect that I'm mentioning. So clearly got an impact here. Then here's a veil. Now, veil looks very similar to this is a 6 gallon per acre rate. So it's not as much starter. We've now added the veil to this to enhance that starter role. It doesn't look quite as good, I have to admit, as the 20 gallons. That's not going to cost me nearly as much, 20 gallons, but it looks much better than the starter or the no starter treatment. And then here's probably the outstanding treatment of them all. Put 6 gallons with NutriCharge, and now look at this corn. It looks better than 20 gallons of fertilizer at a lower rate with this next generation technology here. So this is what's exciting. This is why I think the time has come for us to move in toward to these new technologies, because we can't afford 20 gallons of starter. We got used to having that cheap fertilizer. And yeah, I know a lot about fertilizer. I'm confident in fertilizer. So it was easy just to say, I'll just use more fertilizer. Those days are over. So here's a comparison of the yield between these treatments here. You see the 20 gallons of 1027.0. Yeah, I made 20 bushel. That was a good plot there. But take a look at what we did, where I made over 30 bushel with just 6 gallons. That should be 1027.0 there. I see I got a typo already. And NutriCharge. This is what we're after here. This is the future, and why we're talking about this even here today and trying to show some things. Here's tissue concentrations. Like I said, the issue here is trying to enhance root development. How do we do that? We've got to enhance phosphorus uptake. If you're going to get cell division, phosphorus tissue concentration should be higher. So here's a 2016 study where we're looking at corn tissue concentrations at R1, and we have, again, just the starter fertilizer at low or higher rate, and we've got similar tissue concentrations at 10 gallons using the NutriCharge as we got with 20 gallons just with the night fertilizer alone. So again, well, and you can see the problem with fertilizer, adding more doesn't always result in a response. So that would make this very difficult to talk about adding more fertilizer to make up phosphorus uptake, because you can see I didn't get any increase in phosphorus uptake at all. And that's because oftentimes we increase fertilizer, we create antagonisms with other nutrients such as zinc or magnesium, and that causes us to not get that yield response. And then here's the yield difference between these treatments. And again, you can see the 13 bushel yield there for the two fertilizer treatment, 10 gallons and 20 gallons, no real difference there. But again, our biggest difference is when we use the NutriCharge, we got a significant 20 bushel gain here with our starter treatments. How about in nitrogen long term, how this plays out? And I think this is an illustration of when you get these root systems started, you change the nature of the whole yield. I've said this to growers in North Carolina here all this year. I said, get this crop started. It's no coincidence that North Carolina had the best start to a corn crop we've ever had in 2021, and we made record yields. That's exactly the correlation. you get a crop started, you increase its root mass, you lead to ability to tolerate stress and lead to better consistency and yields. And so here's a good illustration of this, how much that early start changes your crop through the season. So there's a check, the 27 at 5 gallons per acre, that's a low rate. I got some differences there, but look what happens when I put that charged molecule, the NutriCharge, with that to enhance phosphorus. This again is this phosphorus uptake difference. And here's the nitrogen uptake is looking at some 2019 data. You can see how consistent this data is. We're looking at 2019 data. We're looking at nitrogen uptake by V10, and again, reflecting the increase in root mass here at this low rate of a starter solution. Here's the phosphorus in that same test there. Looking at phosphorus uptake and at V10, and you can see the tremendous difference in phosphorus grams per plant is what that it represents there. And I think I've got yield. Yes, indeed, I've got, here's the 2012 yield. Certainly, this is a problem with just 5 gallons of 1027-0. This is why I use more, is I can't get a consistent yield response from just 5 gallons. I'm not picking up enough phosphorus to start that cycle. So here I just got a 3 bushel difference, whereas if I add the NutriCharge, now all of a sudden I got a 15 bushel difference. So again, this is reflective of what is our problem. I can't afford 5 gallons at 3 bushels, but I can afford 15 bushel differences with that 5 gallons and some NutriCharge here. And just to wrap up some of the data that we collected, this was a really great study here in 2021 showing some of these differences at very, very low rates of early fertilizer. We had a 1-to-1 blend of 17-17-0, 1 part nitrogen, 1 part phosphorus, 5 gallons and 2 gallons. And you can see this is plant biomass. So we're looking at differences in how much biomass this plant. So again, a reflection of this early growth. And you can see here that the Nutrisphere is enhancing that biomass of those plants. So get more roots, more above ground biomass. And certainly if I fertilizer, I drive that even harder. And you can see how much the more, that's the beauty of NutriCharge. That's what I like about this approach with this type of charged molecule, is that whatever nutrients I have there, whether it's from litter or from swine effluent or from fertilizer, the more nutrients I have, the better efficiency I get out of those nutrients. Unlike in a typical field situation with more nutrients, typically all you get is just about the same uptake. You're not, in fact, your efficiency is going down in most cases. Here, my efficiency is going up as I apply more nutrients, and that's because I'm able to get them into the plant using this technology. Here's phosphorus. Again, you see the tremendous differences we're getting in phosphorus, almost matching with this lower rate of fertilizer, how much phosphorus we're taking up in this high 1027-0 at 20 gallons. That's just amazing how much impact that's having on phosphorus uptake here. And if we then go to the real tail here, you can see that indeed we're increasing yield significantly in this crop. I'm getting at 2 gallons per acre, I'm getting 11 bushel increase in yield at that very, very low application rate. I think this is the kind of evidence, this consistency of the product and the consistency of this response that leads me to think that this kind of technology is what we should be focused on going forward as we struggle against fertilizer prices, the lack of fertilizers I think we're going to see in the future, driven by issues around climate change and all of these things, we're going to have to get more efficiency out of what we use here. And you can talk about corn, of course, but even soybeans. Typically, you don't think about a starter fertilizer on soybeans, but this past season we did some experimentation with looking at the starter fertilizers on soybeans. Look at that 318-18 at 5 gallons. I'm getting about a 7 bushel per acre increase here in that with that fertilizer. So that's 15, 16, or I've heard somebody say that they thought we could see $17 soybeans. That's kind of increase I'd like to see here. So just wrapping up what we've talked here about today, our issue here is how can we utilize our nutrients more effectively and efficiently particularly now that fertilizer prices and availability are at stake for us, that we've got to get more out of what we have in our soil and out of our fertilizer that we apply. So these studies, as it says there, indicate that these charged molecules have a capacity to help us improve fertilizer phosphorus availability. And that's what they're, if you look at their mode of action, that's what they're talking about. They're protecting the phosphorus that's being applied in the soil. They're helping that maintain that interaction between the phosphorus and the root surface, and therefore driving that reaction or that positive feedback loop that I talked about. So indeed, Nutricharge charged fertilizer can indeed be applied at lower rates with similar or even better results sometimes than just using a high rate of starter alone. Finally, just some conclusions. Starter continue will be one of our most important tools. We have to get root mass. There's no way around that. However we can do that, we have to achieve that or we're going to cut yield. And again, yield is it. That's our only tool for making sure we can afford to grow crops. Starter fertilizer is important. Phosphorus uptake is the key, whether you already have it in the soil and you can apply a Nutricharge with a nitrogen fertilizer and improve starter and improve that nitrogen phosphorus response there, or whether we're applying it as a part of the starter itself. I think Nutricharge has a tremendous opportunity to help us improve nutrient uptake early in that crop growth and starting that cycle. So indeed, they like the source uptake, placement rate, and placement, and all of these things are critical in how we do this. All right, I think that's all I've got. I'll be happy to take some questions here if they've got some questions.
Got one question on here. What's better in furrow, fulvic acid or humic acid?
Fulvic acid actually is a better in furrow as far as getting quick uptake. Fulvics have a lot higher charge density than humics, and therefore are much better at facilitating the nutrient root interaction, the chelating action that fulvics or humics have is much higher in a fulvic acid. So I like fulvics in starter. The only reason you'd use a humic is in a real sandy soil. There, basically, you're trying to help by adding a humic. You're trying to help drive biology. In other words, the growth of your microbes in the soil will be enhanced by a humic there.
We've got another question from Karen, which I'll answer here. It asked whether Nutricharge can be applied to nitrogen as well or just the phosphorus component. So go ahead.
Yeah, and I tried to explain that toward the end there. I did a poor job of it. But yes, no, it could be applied. I focused on phosphorus because of the importance of phosphorus, but it can be applied to nitrogen there, which will then, as the nitrogen drives, in other words, you're utilizing your phosphorus in the soil. It can also protect that nitrogen and enhance that nitrogen uptake efficiency. And at the same time, as that phosphorus becomes available in the soil, that extends that protection to your phosphorus molecules that are being released by the soil, and help them drive into the root. So indeed, it can be applied to nitrogen and have similar, if not just as good impact as it would with a starter that has phosphorus fertilizer.
And what it does in that situation, just from a mode of action standpoint, is it works as a negatively charged molecule and it works with positively charged nutrients. So the nitrogen, it's able to hold on to ammonium and delay the conversion in the soil. And obviously ammonium is a form of nitrogen that doesn't require conversion by the plant. Another question here, two-part question. On sandy loam soil, how much nitrogen can you put in a 3x2x2? And will a P-based starter boost yield more than it was just a straight 24% with sulfur?
Yeah, those are great questions. The first question there, how much nitrogen can I add? I typically would like to stop around 50 units, 50 pounds of nitrogen in a 3x2x2. I think the data from Tony Vinn, now most of his data was actually not on, it was on silt loam, but it's certainly he even on silt loam saw as you got much over 50 to 70 pounds of nitrogen, start to see an impact on emergence on corn. So in a sandy soil, I'd like to stop around 50 units of nitrogen. Let's see, the next part of that question was, now I'm showing my Joe Biden moment. I forgot what the next part of the question was. Read that again.
What is that? Will a P-based starter boost yield more than it was just a straight 24% nitrogen sulfur?
That, again, a great question. The answer to that question depends on your soil test, actually. What I typically recommend growers do if they've got very high to very high amount of phosphorus in their soil, they don't need the P. They don't need the P. It's only when you're average or below average that phosphorus component of that starter becomes a more important component. You're gonna use nitrogen as a starter to drive the start to get that P taking that you already have out of the soil. So no, you don't need P at high or very high phosphorus concentrations in the soil. You can drop that component.
Okay. This next question I can answer. So a typical rate and application of NutriCharge and cost per acre. So NutriCharge rate on phosphorus, recommended application rate is 0.5% volume to volume in the fertilizer solution, up to a 15 gallon an acre application rate. Above 15 gallons an acre, it drops down to 0.25%. What that means in terms of cost for the grower, at 2.5 gallons of starter, it costs the grower $2.25 an acre. Obviously at 5 gallons, $4.50. And then a 20 gallon rate at that high volume rate runs about $9 an acre. So it's always cheaper to add NutriCharge to your starters than it is to add additional phosphorus fertilizer with that efficiency. Another question we have here. Have you tried seaweed extracts in furrow?
I have not. We experimented with some seaweed extracts in a greenhouse study, but we haven't done a in-furrow in-field application with seaweed extracts. The initial impact in the greenhouse studies tended to indicate that indeed it would reduce some salt effects. But again, I'd be reluctant until we have a good trial in the field to really see how much impact that can extend to a typical agricultural soil.
Caleb had a question. He says, if you're banding phosphorus 4 inches below the seed with a dry fertilizer and a strip till system, can we add NutriCharge to it? And do we need a P-based starter? So I can answer the first part of that question. Okay. You can absolutely apply NutriCharge to it. In fact, we've just released, from a handling perspective, it's always difficult treating dry fertilizers with liquids. So we've taken NutriCharge itself and created a dry version of the product that will allow your dealer to be able to apply it much easier to fertilizer. And with that, we've been able to add some of the nitrogen benefits into it as well. So yes, you can apply NutriCharge or a dry product, which is ionized to it. And then second part of the question for you, Ron, is do they need a P-based starter if you're tilling? If
they're banding beneath the seed, my answer to that is yes. What we typically, and we did this with some John Deere, looking at depth of placement of phosphorus and starter here with some John Deere equipment this past year. And actually what we found was it was just as effective placed deeper. Now, that what I think happens is you get some movement of water upwards, and it moves that material up a little bit as it comes up that strip till. But we did not. If the answer to that is yes, it could be just as effective placed underneath the seed.
Okay, another question here. I think this last question. Rose asked, how does Nutritron work on long-term crops? My response to that question is that NutriCharge doesn't matter what form of phosphate you're adding. It just matters that you're adding phosphate to the soil. So as long as that crop requires phosphate, it will change the equilibrium of how phosphorus responds in the soil. And one of the best explanations or examples of this was we just took crops out of the equation entirely last year at BYU Idaho and did a test of how APP responds in a very calcareous soil. And what they're able to demonstrate is that phosphorus treated with NutriCharge in that soil has more than double the amount of phosphorus, soluble phosphorus available to the plant over a long period of time. And so we can typically show that increase in available phosphorus over a 6-month period. So for long-term crops, it does really provide a nice steady supply of freely available phosphorus to that crop. So it doesn't matter if you're growing, field crops to then obviously going into a permanent crop situation. If phosphorus is needed by the crop, then NutriCharge can provide a benefit. So I think that was all the questions. So I just, again, really like to thank you, Ron, for your work and your continued work with us and evaluating the use for these products. What we'll do is we'll make this video available and we'll be able to send it out to everybody so that you can look at it. I'll also include Ron's email and you can reach out to him directly on any of his studies that he's done in the past. But really like to thank everybody for their time. Thank you, Ron.
You bet. Thanks.